Well, good morning and welcome from Paradise, Pennsylvania. I seem to be so long distance away from my friends and colleagues in Munich and those scattered about the world. Again, as others have mentioned, I want to thank the organizers for their efforts to make this happen several times over the past year and a half. And I'm glad we at least finally get to hear each other's papers. My subject today is Tell el-Borg and the Ways of Horus in the Ramesside era. I use the term Ways of Horus to refer to both the route that leads from the northeastern delta to Sinai and also to that general area that constituted Egypt's east frontier. The Ramesside era was ushered in by generals. Of course, General Horemheb became pharaoh at the transition between the 18th and 19th dynasties. And so we might expect that this era would be a military-minded one. Similarly, Ramesses I and Seti I had military backgrounds, military careers, and of course, both of them, interestingly, had been the commandants of the fortress at Tjaru, or the Khetem and Tjaru, and they are, of course, the founders of the 19th dynasty. So it is clear that this physical area, this northeastern frontier, was one that was very familiar to the late 18th dynasty, early Ramesside rulers, and not surprisingly, was an area that was emphasized in Egypt's defense. Much of our knowledge of this zone was made possible through the famous war reliefs of Seti I at Karnak that are well known on the outside of the hypostyle hall. I show you the line drawing that came from Gardner's famous publication in JEA 6 and colored in to help highlight the features we'll be talking about today. Here you see this snapshot or reconstruction of the very entry to Egypt with the sites of the forts of Tjaru or Sile on either side of a body of water that is identified as Tadinit in the inscription. The label Khetem and Tjaru is on the left side or the east side of that body of water. And the following site is called the Dwelling of the Lion, later on the Dwelling of Ramses, the Dwelling of Sesi, and thirdly, the Migdal of Menma'atre. And these three, as we will see in the course of a presentation today, constitute sort of a front line in guarding Egypt's entry points. Now, if we go back to Gardner, this was the map that you'll find in his publication, and to show you how much has changed in a century, where he and many others up until really the 1980s and 90s thought that the site of Tel Heboua was Sile or Tjaru, and that the sequence of sites on the Seti relief are as follows. And of course, what they didn't know at that time was that Ramesses was not at Pelusium, but of course, further to the west in the delta at Kantir. But you see what was understood for a long time, for decades really, from Gardner's study until work began in the 1980s and 90s and into the 2000s in North Sinai. Today, and I'm just giving you a snapshot, we'll go back and show how this was made understandable. We're looking at a corona satellite image from the 1960s, in fact, specifically 1967, December 1967. And this image, of course, is taken at a time before all the recent development in North Sinai, thanks to the Salam irrigation project. Today, if you're to look at this exact same spot in a Google Earth image, you'll see that it's all agriculture, and we'll do that in a moment. As a result of the work of my colleagues, such as Dr. Mohammed Abdul Maqsood and Dominique Valbal, and my own work, we can now say that the ancient route, the ancient road to Canaan, the military road that Gardner wrote about, circled around what was an ancient lagoon that you can see in the very center of this picture, and the red dots represent the known military sites in this area. And here is a Google Earth image, and you can see on the very top farmland, but of course the area we're looking at here is the area of Heboua 1 and 2, which you can see in the Google Earth image. And the area in between was a body of water, just as the SETI relief illustrated. As early as 1995, I was working in the lowland between the two sites, auguring from roughly the corner of the Heboua 1 fort and across at about 50-meter intervals. And we were able to determine, based on the types of shells and the soils, that we're dealing with a Nilotic fluvial component. Early in the work, I solicited the cooperation of geologist colleagues, Dr. Stephen Mosier on the left, and Dr. Baha Gayed from the Geological Survey of Egypt. And we had a wonderful collaboration with our Egyptian geologists and American geologists to help flesh out what this area was like in New Kingdom times. Here is Mosier collecting soil samples for his reconstruction of the Paleo environment. In our excavations at Tel Borg, at one point we were excavating in sand when suddenly the sand gave way, as you can see here, to nice Nilotic silt. And right away we realized that this was no longer just an archaeological excavation, but was also a geological excavation. We launched further studies into the ancient Paleo lagoon and the Bala Depression. Here is Dr. Baha Gayed overseeing drilling, which allowed us to go down 6 and 7 meters below the subsurface to identify the types of silts and sands and shells and so on to gain our picture of this area. When we walk away from it, combining all the data that we have, and we lay this on top of a Google Earth image, here we are looking east. You can see the two fortresses of Tjaru at Heboua 1 and Heboua 2. You can see the brown line representing the road that traversed across the sands between the various bodies of water. And just about 3 kilometers away, come to Tel el-Borg. And then at the southern end of the lagoon is a site Eliezer Orn identified as T21. We'll come back to that later. And then the road would have made a turn east and headed off to Gaza, Canaan. Also on this map, you can see that I followed the identifications of Manfred Bitak in labeling the East Lagoon as the Shihor, the waters of Horus, known to us from Papyrus Anastasi III and other Egyptian sources, and the more south and westerly body of water, the very northern top of which we see here, is the Bala Depression, which extends farther to the north than was realized in the past. And Bitak identified that as the Patufi waters, again, of the Ramesside era. At Tel el-Borg, we discovered 2 forts, showing that this area was strategically important throughout the New Kingdom. What you're looking at here is a shot looking down on the moat of the 18th dynasty, and you can see that this moat has been filled with broken up limestone, crushed limestone, some larger pieces. Here you can see, once cleared out, the limestone chips in the section, and you can also see the amazing fired brick foundations for this moat, the superstructure of which was made of mud brick. And sadly, the entire walls that would have gone beside the moat are completely gone. And here is James Knudsted, the late James Knudsted, who excavated this area and drew such brilliant architectural drawings of this feature. The age of the first fort was clear to us from a number of factors. Mostly the significant number of names we found of Amenhotep II. You'll notice on 4 door lintels here, these were actually found in the foundations of the Ramesside fort, that is the moat of the Ramesside fort, which we'll come to a little bit later on. So clearly the 18th dynasty fort was flourishing in the days of Amenhotep II and may have gone back to Thutmose III. Can't be positive, but it's certainly possible. And you can also see that the name of Amen has been desecrated from these monuments, showing that the monuments were still standing into and probably through the Amarna period. On the right side are two sherds with cartouches of Amenhotep II as well. So all of this, along with the other pottery, suggests that this fort was probably constructed in the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. And it continued down into and maybe through the Amarna period. In the left, we see the corner of the moat, the very top of the moat that's about to turn right. And this is actually the end point. This is the terminal point of the 18th dynasty moat. And off the top of the picture would have been where the gate would have been, nothing of which has survived. However, in the very top of the excavations, we found this amphora seal with the name of Ankh-Khepru-Re, one of the ephemeral successors of Akhenaten. And at a little lower level, once we got down into the edge of the moat itself, a cartouche of Akhenaten himself. So it would seem that in a flourishing fort, the moat would have been largely kept clear, and probably only at the very end was it abandoned and filled, and the debris points to the Amarna period in general. The stones that you see here, limestones, are actually steps into a Ramesside era cistern that was built against the 18th dynasty moat. Here are the side walls of the moat, and where our Bedouin friends are standing and digging, we were looking for any trace of the wall and nothing was found. But you can see that the wall here of the moat is very well preserved, as it was in much of the area on the east side. But as we move to the west, we find that the moat walls had been severely damaged by water. And you can see here that the nice mud brick superstructure is completely eroded away. And you can see the descending line of the stratigraphy, all of this suggesting that water had come in the course of time, had completely melted down the mud brick walls. Here is a look at the west end of that section, and you can see the deteriorated mud from the moat that had just slumped into the bottom of the original fired brick foundation. On the south side, similar phenomenon occurred with the bricks just coming to an end like this, and indications of erosion by water. And here's a good section drawing to illustrate that slumping off that you see. Now, here is a plan, the red representing the 18th dynasty fort, the brown lines to the right or to the east, southeast, the Ramesside period fort. And what we know, thanks to the work of our geologists, is that we had a distributary of the Nile that passed between the two sides of Tel el-Borg. And we believe that what had happened in the course of time of Nile floods, that it began to erode the sands away, and perhaps a high Nile or two, a good robust flood, may have led to the complete collapse of the back wall. We made every effort with magnetometry and excavating down as deep as possible, and could find no trace whatsoever of the back of the fort wall. So here's a basic plan of the two forts, a schematic plan showing the 18th dynasty fort, and then the Ramesside era fort to the right. Now, this placement of the two forts is very interesting. Only in this area here do we actually have the stratigraphic relationship between the two, and well, we have a little bit up here as well. But so it's very clear that the fort on the right, the fort on the east, is the later fort built on top of the remains, and the chipped limestone was found in here. So this area was intentionally filled for the construction of the second fort, we believe, as a result of flood. Here we can see some of the traces of the wall found in 2000. This is a wall that was almost missed because it had been bulldozed when the canal beside us was constructed. You can see these lines across here. These are tooth marks of loaders that had been digging. And as a consequence, the whole area was smeared. It must have been wet. And only with careful troweling and investigation were we able to determine there were bricks in this matrix of mud and shells. And so this is the wall of the Ramesside fort on the west side of the irrigation canal. What you're looking at here is the very corner where there was a tower, and the same images on the right looking towards the east. The significance of this is that we actually have two phases. So the blue arrow there points to the earlier tower. When a second tower was built, it cut into the earlier tower for the foundation. So you can see the earlier and later phases of the second fort. And then the red arrow is pointing to the top of the 18th dynasty moat, and you can see how it rides underneath the Ramesside tower. So very clear the stratigraphic relationship between the two. On the east side of the canal, you can just see on the top the rushes growing in the water of this drainage canal. And here is the 3.8 meter wide mudbrick wall of the Ramesside fort. And you can see we're down to the last couple bricks. On the right side here, you can see, again, the damage done by the front end loaders when the canal and the adjacent bridge were constructed. And as we move down towards the northeastern corner, we are down to the final brick. So you can see what the erosion, wind, and rain here in this northern Mediterranean, close to the Mediterranean would have looked like. We now have the footprint of the fort, but so much of it is completely lost. Now the wall we have here now turning to the south, and at the top of the picture, we have the gate area, more of which we'll talk about later. In addition to the walls we've just looked at, we had two segments of moats that were found on either side, those purple lines. And here you can see what we first found in 2000, where 17.5 meters of moat is preserved. And you can get the idea of how much of this was wiped out. No doubt somewhere between 2 and 3 meter deep construction was lost. Here you can see where some of it is preserved to a greater height, maybe another meter in height. And down here we're at the very bottom, and we see stones and bricks, including, this was earlier view, and somebody moved this around between seasons in our digging, but nevertheless, a Talatat block of Akhenaten vintage. When we cut a section through the fort moat, we found once again the use of fired brick, probably from the areas where the moat of the earlier fort was destroyed, and also Talatat blocks that had been hewn in half to make half-size blocks for this foundation. On the north side, more of the moat was preserved, and right in the middle here, we found a collection of equid bones, and you can see a better look at them here. A couple horses, maybe a mule, and a donkey was found a little bit further away. But you can also notice these stone blocks in the foundation, fired brick, and among these were the Amenhotep II blocks I showed you earlier. Now, the gate area of the Ramesside fort had its own share of clues. As you can see, very little, almost nothing of the actual blocks of the fort were preserved. But we can have established a basic footprint of the gate. So for instance, here we have a good illustration of the foundation trenches of the Ramesside fort, which appeared first, the dark, muddy, shelly fill. And right in the middle of the picture, you see 3 Talatat blocks still in situ. This is about the only thing we found in situ from the Ramesside fort. So clearly, there is a reuse of earlier Akhenaten materials. This, along with the crushed stone found in the fill of the moat, is suggestive to us that there was some sort of Akhenaten temple that was being used in the construction of the Ramesside forts. Whether it was local or whether it was transported from the Delta somewhere, we don't know for sure, although I'm tempted to think that there may have been an Akhenaten temple to the Aten somewhere in North Sinai. Now here's a plan of the gate, again, the excellent work of James Knudstedt. But this is an interesting gate because it has three compartments, probably the foundations for the towers, and then the central part would have been the entrance. There were a pair of parallel walls that extend from the gate, but that seems to be part of the second phase. In the red block, we found a large, very thick area of mud brick. There's a little bit on the left side, as you can see in the circle. Here is this large swathe of mud brick that had congealed together and again was almost not recognizable as brick. In fact, we had to actually cut into it in order to see the bricks. And we have the bricks laying on end, which is something we do find in Ramesside constructions in the foundational block. So here is the foundation line, and there must have been a large structure above it. What we're suggesting is that this was actually the tower, or one of the two towers of the earliest phase of this fort. If you remember, the corner tower in Field 4 also had two phases, an earlier and a secondary phase, and we believe all within the Ramesside era. While I can't prove it, it is suggestive to me that this first phase might have been the work of Horemheb. We know that Horemheb was responsible for demolishing the temples of the Aten all over Egypt, and it may be his signature as a part of his new construction to have incorporated the Talatat blocks into that reconstruction. We found two mud bullae with the name of Horemheb on it, and also the bezel of a ring. So it's very clear there was some sort of official activity going on in the era of Horemheb. And so as a working hypothesis, I would suggest that perhaps Horemheb, maybe Seti I, built the first phase, and the second phase, which we'll talk about now, built by Ramses II. I say Seti I with a little bit of uncertainty because his name was not found anywhere among the blocks or bullae or sherds like we have of other names. No amphora of Seti. In fact, none from the 19th dynasty. All the amphora we found are from the Akhenaten Amarna period. Now the gate was destroyed, and I think what we're seeing is two different phases of destruction. An ancient one from the period when the fort was attacked, and then probably when the fort was no longer being used, and we have the removal of blocks for other purposes. These two operations may have been relatively close to each other, we don't know, but you can see many blocks were found scattered around. Among them, we found the block on the left, the cartouche of Ramses, superimposed over an Aten disc from a broken talatat. So here again is a reused block, in this case with Ramses' name. Indeed, Ramses II's name is found dozens of times on our various blocks and shards of limestone, like this beautiful one with the falcon and the shenu pointing towards the cartouche of Ramses II. We also found two cases where the cartouche of Merneptah was found. So it seems that he too added some decoration to the gate area. And the latest name that we found, although partially preserved, is the name of Ramses III. So there's every reason to believe that this fort continued in use down into the 20th dynasty. The pottery from the gate area would also support this conjecture. So again, here's a look now of much of the stone cleared out, mud brick and mud and stone foundations. There's a patch of mud brick here. So it seems that there was a mud brick core to the towers, and then the limestone was added as a veneer and decorated. The red arrow is pointing to a stone that was part of, and we found many of these that were part of the entranceway or the walkway. Here are a whole group of these floor stones that were, in this case, burnt. You can see the blackened color. And this one in particular is interesting because the type of cracks, the sort of circular shape to the cracks, are indicative, my geologists tell me, of limestone cracking under heat, not pressure, but heat. So it seems that the gate endured some sort of an attack, which elsewhere in print I have suggested may well have been Sea Peoples. Here's our reconstruction of the entrance, the gate, and everything you see can be illustrated by either architectural pieces or by the foundation trenches. And we'll talk more in a moment about the two stelae that were seated at the end of the parallel walls that created this courtyard effect at the entrance of the gate. We also found a number of blocks indicating a battle scene. Now, these blocks were found about 200 meters to the south of the gate. They were found in a pit where they had been summarily dropped. Why they were dropped there, we don't know. They were found quite by accident when the canal engineers were digging, and their front end loaders or their backhoes, whatever they were using, dug up and exposed these blocks. We excavated and found them. And you can see on this line drawing of Seti I, the block of the archer's arm, the waist and the harnesses and the javelins of the chariot wheel right here. And then we also found a block with the escaping enemy. And if you look at the very bottom, you can see by the headdress that these are shasu, much like seen here on the scene at Karnak. Proof that this scene originated at this location is that we found in the debris in the door this shard about 8 centimeters long containing the eye of a horse. And here you can see the eye lines over the horse. So clearly the horse chariot scene was found originated in the gate area. Now the horse fragment you're looking at on the left that we found is facing to the left. The other scene is facing to the right. So it suggests we had two such scenes, but where they fit, we can't say for sure. It's fun to speculate based on the architectural pieces that we found where they might have gone. We may have had a triumph scene like the one from Tel Heboua shown here on the right, based on the two blocks that we found where the deity is standing in front of the Horus name and cartouche of the king, sadly missing in our case. But this is until the discovery of our block. This is the only example known to Kenneth Kitchen, who studied these materials with us, that there was a deity standing in front of the name. Normally one would expect, as on the left side of the picture, the Horus name and the cartouche with the king. So maybe this went here, we don't know. The door lintel, large door lintel, may have gone on the side of the entrance. And one wonders if battle scenes might not have been on these parallel walls. It's just a suggestion. I'm open to other ideas. Now, again, bear in mind the two stelae at the front of these walls. We found two foundations to piers. This was local, very poor quality sandstone that laid the foundation, and presumably there was a granite plinth on which the stela stood. And you can see behind the section wall, the brown wall of the parallel foundation that came out and joined up with the pier. You can see burning everywhere in this area. Digging here, one got very dirty very quickly because of ash. Here's one section. And what's notable is that all this burning that you're seeing here, the stone fragments, the shards that you see here are all limestone. These are from the stelae. On top, we have the limestone. So it seems that the attack on the fort was aimed at the entrance, not surprisingly, and the stelae were intentionally destroyed. So here you can see the courtyard, there you can see the one foundation, the other foundation, and we collected piles and piles of broken, uninscribed limestone materials. Again, close look, you can see the burning. These were intentionally burnt, and that's how they were broken, perhaps burnt and then hammered and easily shattered. A number of inscribed pieces were identified, and you can see here some of them. Again, the cartouche with Usur Matre, the setup and ray there on the top right. And here is some of the pieces that made up the stela that would have stood on the north side, and then the stela as it would have stood on the south side with the very top. The size of these would be comparable to those found at Tanis and those found by Monte elsewhere, and now in the Ismailia Museum. So they're about 2 meters tall. The other inscribed piece that would have originated in the gate was this block, again, another triumph scene in which the deity is extending his arm. But notice the text, D, N, E, and Ek, Tashu, Ek, Im, that I given to you, whatever, the sword, the chepesh, whatever it is, presumably to widen your borders or to extend your borders there, something like this. The idea that the stele function as a border indicator, these are views shared by people like Karel Vogel, and the idea of borders, internal, external borders by Galan. So I think this is all significant, as we'll come to our conclusion here in a moment. So back to our reconstructed zone here, we can see the line that we have here between the forts at Tjaru, or Heboua I and Heboua II, Tel el-Borg, and at the southern end of the Paleo Lagoon, I believe, would be the site of Migdal, the third site in the sequence of the Seti reliefs. So what I'm suggesting is that this line of forts that you can see suggested by this red line constitutes something of a border, that collectively these forts represent the border, much like the 12th dynasty stele found at Semna and in Nubia would have constituted a border. And so it's not a single place, but actually a line that connects these three sites. So what I'm proposing here today is that fortresses of Tjaru are a main entry point. And of course, the strategic nature of both Heboua I and II and Tel el-Borg is that they both straddle Nilotic branches. And so these were strategic defensive points. Anyone entering Egypt from the east, like the Sea Peoples, I believe would have had to come into the lagoon and into the branches of the Nile. And therefore, these forts were very strategic, both for possible attack by water, but also by land coming around through the series of forts you can see on the road. So that's why this zone is so significant. And Tel el-Borg is sort of a miniature version of the Heboua I and Heboua II, in that it guarded a secondary fluvial Nile River entrance to Egypt. Now, one last thing to say about our fort, and this was determined based on this 3-line inscription found on a small limestone block. It was actually found quite by accident on the very first day of digging, when Lila Pinch Brock was walking around the site looking and saw this stone face down, and she flipped it over with her foot, and lo and behold, it had a text. And the text identifies the military company that was stationed at Tel el-Borg, the great company of Amun. Amun appears gloriously and victorious, for Usama Re set up and Re given life like Re forever, made by the weapons bearer, Shesep. For us, what's significant is that this tells us something about the fort, that it was connected to the division of Amun, number one, and that Asa was made up of 250 soldiers and 3 senior officers. There were junior officers as well in a division like this. And obviously Shesep would have been one of the lower ranking officers as the weapons bearer. So this might suggest to us that when fully equipped, fully manned, the fort had about 250 soldiers plus military officers. There are other reasons to believe, namely in a Sinai stela showing the dwelling of Sesi, that we have the Hairy Pedge, who presumably was the Hairy Pedge, the commander of the fortress Tjaru, visiting the site. So it appears that whoever the commanding officer was at our little fort, they reported to the main man at the nearby Chetem and Tjaru. So a rather small contingent of 250, but as we learned from our excavations, there were women and children and parents. We learned this from the osteological remains, where we have multiple generations buried in the same tomb, and we have women, and we had one child burial, and so on. So it's clear that it was not just soldiers that lived here, but we actually had entire families. So at this very strategic location, then Tel el-Borg was sort of the middle point in what I'm calling the frontier line, with Tjaru, the two forts there to the northwest, and to the south, the fortress of Migdal Menma'atre. And these three together constitute something of a front line to defend Egypt from attack from the east during the Ramesside era. Thank you very much.